Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for an interesting session on why microplastics are not the whole story. I am Mageswari Sanggaralingam, Research Officer with the Consumers Association of Penang and Sahabat Alam Malaysia, or Friends of the Earth Malaysia. Cap and Sam are both members of IPAN, and Sam is very happy to co-organize this very insightful webinar with IPAN today. I'm joining you from Penang, Malaysia, and I'll be your moderator for the webinar. Just a few reminders, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made public in IPAN's YouTube channel later on. We are also live streaming on the Facebook pages of a number of IPAN participating organizations throughout the region. Another reminder is language interpretation for Arabic, Chinese, French, Russian, and Spanish are available. You may click on the interpretation button down below and choose the language of your choice. Now, to welcome us all today, I call upon Leah Esquilo, IPAN Programs and Policy Coordinator. Over to you, Leah.
Thank you, Magas. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. On behalf of IPAN and SAM, I am pleased to welcome you all. Nice to see you again, those of you who have been attending IPAN's webinar series. And to those who are joining us for the first time, a most pleasant welcome. To briefly introduce IPAN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network is a global NGO network, and our members are in 125 countries. We work for a toxics-free future. We link local, regional, and international efforts to prevent harm from chemicals and waste. On the issue of plastics, IPAN believes that this is not just a litter or waste management problem, rather that plastics' entire life cycle is problematic. Every stage of the life cycle of plastic involves toxic chemicals, which threaten human health, the environment, biodiversity, and the climate. Marcos Aureliana, the UN Human Rights Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, recently issued a powerful report asserting this. His report said that the global plastics crisis reveals how every stage of the plastic cycle, from extraction and refining, production, transport, use, and waste, has adverse effects on the full enjoyment of human rights. It's a powerful report, and do check it out if you have time. So in IPAN, we do research and projects that reveal hazardous substances in all stages of plastics life cycle. These are some of the reports we have published recently about it. And some of these reports will be touched on in this webinar. So you can check out these reports on IPAN's website. Here's the link. And this is also the link to the recent UN Special Rapporteur report. Again, a warm welcome to all. I look forward to an active discussion, especially in the Q&A. Back to you, Magas.
Thank you very much, Leah, for the welcoming remarks. Yeah, as Leah had mentioned, every stage of the life cycle of plastics is associated with hazardous chemicals. Yeah? Friends, I'm sure you are anxiously waiting to learn about why microplastics are not the whole story. We will hear from Therese Carlson, an expert on microplastics. Therese had recently joined IPAN as a science and technical advisor. Therese has a background in plastics research and did a PhD in marine sciences, where she focused her research on microplastics. In IPAN, she works on new POPs and POP-RC, plastics and ocean pollutants. Therese is based in the IPAN Gotland, Sweden office. Over to you, Therese.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm also really grateful to the organizers for setting all this up. To make it a little bit easier for translators and also to make sure that there are subtitles, I've made a recording of the presentation that I'm going to try to share with you. Hi, my name is Therese Carlson, and I want to tell you a story about why microplastics isn't the story. And this might seem a little bit odd because I spent years researching microplastics, and I even wrote my PhD thesis on microplastics. But stick with me and I'll explain what I mean. About 10 years ago, I heard about the garbage islands in the Pacific, and I was absolutely horrified. How could there be that there were plastic islands twice the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific? The problem was, or the problem is, that there never was such a thing as a plastic island. When you trace it back, this narrative was created due to faulty translations between different newspapers. And people that have actually been to those areas show pictures that look more like this. And scientists have since tried to clarify that it's more like a plastic soup or a plastic smog of litter across our oceans. And this matters because if we're going to solve a problem, we need accurate problem descriptions. If we don't have that, the solutions just won't be adapted to the actual problem. So a more accurate representation of the current situation would be something like this. And don't get me wrong, this is worrying. The fact that we find plastics in most places that we look for it, including at the bottom of the ocean, in the middle of the ocean, in the Arctic, and several species of fish and birds is worrying. But it's not the story, it's only part of it. And ultimately, the challenges that are associated with microplastics can almost always be traced back to one or several of these three things. How we produce and consume materials, how we manage waste, and what kind of policies and laws that our decision makers create or don't create to protect us and the environment from harm. But in order to understand these 3 points a little bit more, let's go back a bit. We don't actually have to go this far back, but I've always found it oddly poetic that plastic dinosaurs are made from fossil fuels. So theoretically, they could contain traces of dinosaurs, but that's a bit of a stretch. So instead, let's look at fossil fuels. Most plastics are made up from fossil fuels, and I don't think I need to tell any one of you that our current dependency on fossil fuels is detrimental to human health and the environment. It's threatening ecosystems, the climate, and it's preventing us from creating a sustainable future. Plastics are a significant part of that dependency, and the CO2 emissions from the plastics industry are only expected to increase in the coming years. The oil is then used to create these plastic pellets that are later turned into different types of plastic products. And these pellets have been found in the environment since the 70s. And their presence in the environment is often linked to spills during production, transport, and storage. And a few years ago, I did a study on these pellets in Sweden, where we found that millions of pellets leaked out from one production plant just due to continuous smaller scale spills. Even though there are regulatory frameworks in place that should prevent it, if those frameworks had actually been properly implemented. And if it's not small continuous spills, it can also be big spills that happen during, for example, shipping. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about what happened in Sri Lanka earlier this year, where a container ship caught fire and sank. A lot of its cargo leaked out, and pictures like this have come to represent what has become known as the worst ecological disaster in Sri Lanka's history. And we still have no idea how this accident and this mixture of chemicals, plastics, and oil will affect the environment long term. To make matters worse, the pellets can include a wide range of chemicals, which are often referred to as additives. Additives are different chemicals that are used to give the plastic specific properties. For example, color or antibacterial agents. And here again, I want to point out that microplastics are just part of the story. We often hear stories about microplastics in drinking water or in fish. And a few years ago, me and a few colleagues decided to look a bit closer at it. And if we, for example, look at bisphenol A, which is a known endocrine disruptor, often used in plastic products, we can see that even if this can be present in microplastics that are present in mussels, or so in theory, the mussels could eat microplastics, we could eat the mussels, and we could get some of the bisphenol into us through that pathway. But those are very small concentrations compared to how much of bisphenol A that we would be exposed to from our own plastic usage and packaging, which is a million times higher. So we need to look at things in perspective. And it's not that microplastics aren't part of the story, but it's not the story. The story is, how are we using plastics and what kind of chemicals are we allowing in the plastics? So if we're going to look broader at additives and what kind of chemicals are used in plastics, this article was published earlier this year, and it showed that 10,000 substances are used in plastics. And of those, more than 2,400 are substances of concern. Another really important article in this context is this one from 2019, and it looked at chemicals in plastic packaging. The article is really interesting as a whole, but one key sentence in it is this one. Our work was challenged by lack of transparency and incompleteness of publicly available information on both the use and the toxicity of numerous substances. So over 10,000 substances are used in plastic products, but it's really hard, even for scientists in this field, to find information about what chemicals are used where and what the toxicity of those chemicals are. One group of plastic additives that have been particularly discussed recently is UV stabilizers. There are about 700 different UV stabilizers, and they're used to protect the plastics from the sun. One group is benzotriazoles, and this group has several different chemicals, of which several that are either known to be persistent, bioaccumulating, and toxic, or are currently being assessed as such. One benzotriazole in particular is being discussed, which is UV328. It's currently being assessed as a persistent organic pollutant, so a POP, which would mean that would fall under the Stockholm Convention. But that's a little bit on production. Let's move over to consumption. And plastics have for long been marked as a very convenient product, often intended for short-term use. This picture is from 1955. And plastics are amazingly versatile. They're useful in a lot of ways. Just not the way that we're currently using them. If we look at microplastics in the context of using, one thing that's been discussed a lot is microplastics in toothpaste. And this is quite obviously an unnecessary use of plastics. But what I find interesting is how people talk about, and often also how I felt about it when I first heard it, in terms of, I don't want plastics in my mouth. And that means that we've lost trace a little bit about the larger context of how much plastics we use. And how we use it. Because plastics are present in all aspects of our lives. And we have very little insight as to what is actually being put into the plastics that we use. All we really know is that a lot of different substances can be used in plastics, and a lot of them have been associated with negative effects on the environment and on human health. But on the consumption side, of course, one of the main issues is that we consume so much, and it's just continuously increasing. This is also putting a massive burden on waste management. And earlier this year, a few colleagues here at IPEN wrote this report. It's filled with a lot of technical information and it's a huge asset on best practices. But I would like to lift two specific conclusions. And those are, without changes in the current practices, 108 million tons of plastics will be landfilled, dumped, or openly burned in 2050, mainly in low-income countries. They also concluded that neither mechanical nor chemical recycling have the capacity or potential to reduce plastic pollution to the environment, unless plastic production is regulated and minimized. Once again, the chemicals that are added to the plastics can create threats to human and environmental health, as illustrated by this report that shows that plastic waste is poisoning food. And by this report that shows that plastic waste disposal leads to contamination of the food chain. On top of this, mismanaged plastic waste often end up polluting the environment. Here's an image from one of our partner organizations, Carbon Guinea, from a beach in Guinea, where you can barely see the beach for all the plastics. And of course, microplastics are part of this story, but it's not the story. If we zoom out, we can see that the story consists of several chapters, starting with raw material, since most plastics are based on fossil fuels, moving into the production, where more than 10,000 substances can be added to create the plastic products, of which many are harmful to the environment and human health, and they're often used with low transparency and limited regulation. Moving on to the chapter on consumption, where we can see that we use plastics in all aspects of our lives. The production keeps increasing, and still we have very little insight into what is added to the plastics that we use. And then continuing to waste management, where it's quite clear that with the current high production levels of plastics, in combination with the lack of regulation on what is being put into that plastics, it is not feasible to manage waste sustainably. The story paints a quite dark picture, but the upside is that if we understand a problem and the roots of that problem, it's much easier to see the solutions. And if we really look at the roots of the problem, we can see that in order to limit the harm that plastics, plastic chemicals, and microplastics can cause for humans and the environment, we need to decrease consumption. We need to have policies and legislations aimed at eliminating toxic chemicals in plastics. We need to have a much better transparency as to what is being used where, and we need to improve waste management. So from my perspective, microplastics are part of the story, but it's not the story. In order to look at the solutions, we need to zoom out and we need to look at the bigger story behind. That will also help us find the solutions to these problems. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for some more interesting reports that will be published later during this fall.
Thank you, Therese, for your explanation. And yeah, Therese has given an overview of why microplastics is part of the bigger story of plastic pollution, the overproduction and toxicity of plastics, and the lack of transparency and accountability of plastics producers. Let's all give us, Therese, a virtual round of applause. All right, now I would like to call upon Ashlina Azara Akilani, or we call her Nina. She's co-captain of the River Warrior from Indonesia, to react on Teresa's sharing on microplastics. Nina, over to you.
Hello everyone, I'm Nina. I'm 14 years old. I'm the co-captain of River Warrior Indonesia. And my English is not really good, so I'm so sorry if I say something wrong. Okay, so in Indonesia, there is lack of waste management service. So people throw their waste into the rivers. 8 million tons of plastic waste is dumped into the environment. Every minute, 6 tons or 1 dump truck are dumped into the sea. And tropical countries like Indonesia are rich in sunlight, accelerate the process of fragmenting plastic waste into microplastic. River Warrior, my team, and Ecoton researched and found that 98% of Indonesia's river water contains microplastic. And fish in the big river of Java Island have been contaminated with microplastic. And salt, air, and also feces, 100 samples of people in Java contains microplastic. 70 particles in every 10 grams of feces. And microplastics are composed of hormone-disrupting compounds, like Therese said, and can cause hormonal disturbances in humans. Microplastic exists because we treat river and nature as plastic bins. The pattern of single-use plastic consumption must be changed. So I think the right way for us to stop the plastic pollution into the environment, we have to refuse single-use plastic or reduce single-use plastic. Yeah, so that's very inspiring and that's very interesting matter from Therese. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Nina. Yeah, you had given us really frightening data in the situation in Indonesia. For your information, friends, among others, Nina has been featured in a film titled Girls for Future, which follows 4 girls from Senegal, Indonesia, Australia, and India who fight for a better future. Yeah? And Nina speaks on plastic-based pollution in Indonesia, and like her parents, are fighting plastic pollution, yeah, in their region. Okay, so I'm sure you will have lots of questions for Therese, and feel free, if you can write in the Q&A there. And before we start the Q&A session, we would also like to request participants to fill the survey. Yeah, and okay, so let's see whether there are any questions. Okay, first question, Therese. It is quite alarming to know and see that plastics have been increasingly utilized in many countries. Besides the need for legislation, what is your recommendation to effectively influence or impact a change on how people are currently treating plastics? Something doable for an individual without depending on the government.
Thank you for that question. I would say that, so I think there's a trend of putting a lot of focus on the consumer's responsibility, which is why I would always gravitate towards saying that it's better if we influence governments and legislators to make sure that they put demands on the industry, especially, so that we don't put all of the focus on the consumer. But I know that this question is without depending on the government. And there I would say that, well, actually I would say that the things that Nina are doing, for example, are absolutely amazing. Like that is, in a way, it's addressing governments, but it's not depending on governments. And that type of campaign really has an impact so what Nina has been doing is, one of the things that Nina's been doing, she's been doing a lot of incredible things, is that she's been going to governments all over the world and asking them to please stop sending waste to Indonesia, which is an incredible campaign.
Yes, I agree with you, Therese. Yeah, so not put the blame solely on consumers. Yeah. Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, There's another question here. Is there any court cases against any particular company, which is the main polluter, like the plastic wrappers found in the river or sea?
Well, I know that there's a lot of campaigns focused on specific polluters, but in terms of court cases, I think the ones that I've read the most about are the ones that have been towards the pre-production pellets. And there have been several court cases, for example, against spills during shipping, but also from a production plant in the US where they saw a lot of pellets around, and there was a court case that was actually quite successful. Most of the time, the cleanup efforts ends up on more of a volunteer basis, or the community has to pay the costs. But there's a few court cases that have been more successful.
There was one comment thanking you for the information. Okay, and another question is, what is your view of eco bricks used to trap plastic pieces from the environment?
I'm not entirely sure that I know what eco bricks are, but I'm assuming it's something similar to these nets that you put up in, for example, some rivers or in the water.
Like for eco bricks, what people are doing is like putting all this small sachet packets or plastic wrappers into this bottles, plastic bottles, and making it like bricks.
I think we need a lot of different solutions to battle these problems. There is, however, one big pitfall whenever using plastics into another product, and that is that we use so many chemicals in plastics. And as I touched upon before, there's very little transparency as to what those chemicals are. So recycling and reusing and kind of repurposing, which this sounds more like, are all really good things. But we need to make sure that we can do it without inheriting a toxic legacy, like bringing these chemicals further and further into our life.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, because we have been campaigning from the production stage itself. Yes. Okay, so there's a question from Bahrain. Since the base of fuel production is microplastic, is it not difficult to convince or to encourage the oil countries, such as in GCC, I'm not sure what is that, to consider better alternatives? He sees it as a challenging case, and it will not hinder until the fossil fuel is finished from nature.
I love this. I love this. I think it's so easy to forget the close links. I mean, the very, very close links that plastics have to the fossil fuel industry, and how this many times, yes, the fossil fuel industry has a very strong lobby and a lot of money. They have a lot of power to affect policies and change. So yes, this has a huge impact on how easy it is to create changes. And I think it's really good to remember that plastics has its background in fossil fuels.
So we have a question from Samia. Especially during this COVID-19 pandemic, they find that dealing with governments on plastic at this time of economic crisis, also which is also caused by the COVID pandemic, is very difficult. And it's really very challenging. We are facing that problem in almost all over the world. Yeah? Do we have any response to that?
That's a really tricky question. I think when it comes down to it, so I'm talking about how we need to zoom out from microplastics to look at plastics as a whole. But then we also need to zoom out and look at sustainability as a whole, which is that easily turns into kind of a conversation that has a lot of words in it and very little meaning, let's say. But I still do think it's important. We need to, when we're talking about sustainability, we need to look at it from every aspect of it. And that's where the sustainability goals come in, where we're looking at human health, and we're looking at access to clean water, and we're looking at pollution in general. Like all of those things need to come as one. But in terms of lifting environmental issues during a pandemic, that I understand that this is very challenging for a lot of people, because we're quite short-sighted in general. And the environmental issues, they are definitely a problem already, but they will become increasingly a problem. But now we're facing a pandemic, which is a very urgent problem. So I don't know. I don't think I have any good, I agree with you, but I don't think I have any good suggestions on how to get away from it.
Thanks, Therese. It's kind of a difficult question to respond to. For your information, friends and attendees here, we also have Sarah Brosh, who is the IPAN Science Advisor present here. And if you have any questions, she may also give her views on these questions. Yeah. So the next question, this is interesting. Are there any regulations on microbeads used in cosmetics or other things? What is the attitude of MNCs about this?
MNCs, I'm very bad at abbreviations.
Multinational corporations. So it's basically corporations.
So there are several rules. I think most of them are European based. And most of them have been focused on microplastics in rinse-off products. So it wouldn't actually, so makeup wouldn't count, but toothpaste would count, or face scrub would count. So recently, more and more rules have been adapted for this to avoid or to prevent producers from putting microplastics into cosmetics.
There is also another question regarding microplastics. This is from Ram from Nepal. So he is saying that microplastics has been found in snow and water samples collected from the Himalayas over 8,000 meters from sea level. So this is coming from plastics items carried by international mountaineering teams outside of Nepal, from outside of Nepal. How can we make those international polluters liable to clean up this microplastic pollution?
And this is, I would say, one of the big challenges that we have with waste and plastics is that it's so transboundary. It moves over country lines everywhere. And so which is also why we need to work on an international scale with these issues. So there's a UN plastics treaty that is currently being negotiated. There's also the Basel Amendment. These can help in lifting these issues, but I think a lot of it is, unfortunately, comes down to local campaigning and making sure to lift these issues, making sure to put attention to these issues, and also for the rest of the world to then help lift these challenges that are faced in different ways in different regions. So in that region, it's rivers. In other regions, it might be that it comes through from the marine environment. And in other regions, it might be that it's more due to the global waste trade. But those are all kind of interconnected challenges.
Let me see, there are quite a number of questions on microplastics now. So there is this question, how to get authorities, like the government, to consider microplastics or other pollution as an urgent issue. Yeah, because so far in the person's country, he had not mentioned which country, they only have data for the past 10 years and still there's no change. Yeah, so there should be an increase in environmental improvement and pay for quality testing. Yeah, so in terms of this, it's more on the microplastics production itself. Yeah.
No, I can recognize this from several regions, that it's somehow we end up stuck in this loop of we need to test it, we need more data. And that's problematic. And that's also why I want to make sure that we look at it from a bigger angle, that it's not just microplastics, it's the whole way of how we're using plastics. In terms of how to get governments interested in it, I think that depends a lot on where you're based, because those campaigning strategies will always look different from country to country, in my experience.
So another question, anonymous question. Many environmental health scientists have referred to the impact that microplastics have in the human body, passing directly into the blood and organs of the body, where they remain causing inflammation and chronic diseases, absorbing toxics, and some scientists have declared this as one of the most significant public health impacts of the Anthropocene. Do you agree that the inherent properties of plastic, that is, it doesn't break down, poses a significant risk to human health separate from the chemical aspects of plastic? What are your views on this? Please.
Yes, so there is some data that would support this. That data is very experimental, and we don't know how much of it is problematic. We know that humans in general are quite good at dealing with most types of particles, but in terms of it basically we eat it and then it goes out. But we can't dismiss. There are some studies that have been done, for example, on plastic migration from hip replacement or other kinds of plastics that's been put into the body that causes some concern. I do think that this is something that should be investigated, and it should be considered as a potential risk among many when it comes to microplastics. But I also think that, or plastics in general, but I also want to stress that when it comes to chemicals, we do know that there's quite a lot of harm towards human health. So I don't want that debate to take over and say that, well, we don't actually know, so it's probably okay, because we do know that the chemicals associated with plastic products can have several effects on human health.
Okay, we shall give Therese a break. Nina, probably you can share with us, on what your initiatives in addressing microplastics in Indonesia. Yeah, you have a lot of young people together with you, campaigning on this. So what have you done so far, Nina? Please share your experience.
Yeah, I have a team, River Warrior, and now the schools start to offline school again. The schools are open, so me and my friends, we're doing a lot of campaign to ban single-use plastic with other classes with my friends, and we do beach cleanup and plastic waste burn audit, and then after we do a plastic waste burn audit, we wrote a letter for the producer to ask the responsibility for them to stop producing the non-recyclable plastic and ask them to redesign their non-recyclable plastic package to the reusable, refillable, or like compostable packaging, And we also did, we cleaned the riverbank close to our house, because our house is kind of pretty close, and in front of our house there are Brandas River that is very dirty, and we always, not always, maybe like one times a week, we clean the riverbank with my friends, with my team, and we always do campaign to ban single-use plastic offline or online. We have the Instagram account. So yes, we always share to our friends about the dangers of microplastic and what's the plastic is dangerous, Plastic contains a lot of toxic chemicals, just like Therese said. And I always ask my friends to ban big six. So first, we have to refuse plastic bag. We can change it to tote bag or reusable bag. And straw, plastic straw, we have to change it with stainless straw or bamboo straw, or don't use straw, just drink it. And sachet, yes, we have to refuse sachet, because sachet is a multi-layer, right? It have a multi-layer plastic, and it's very hard to reusable, and it's very hard to reusable, to recycle. And then styrofoam. Styrofoam is also very dangerous for our health, right? So we have to change it to a lunchbox. We have to bring our own lunchbox. And then a plastic bottle, we can change it to a tumbler or like a bottle, reusable bottle, because 90% water inside the bottled water contaminated with microplastic. And the last is reusable, plastic diaper, we have to change it to a reusable diaper or like reusable menstrual pad. Yeah. And I also did a plastic waste exhibition at my school. So I asked my friend to reuse single-use plastic and go for zero waste lifestyle.
Really awesome, yeah, all the actions that you have taken. You are our future generation, yeah? And good. Okay, so there have been a lot of questions regarding whether there's any specific regulations to prohibit additives in plastics or also in terms of microplastics itself.
So there are some regulations in Stockholm Convention, for example, about chemicals that have restricted use or are not allowed to use. But with 10,000 different substances, 2,400 of being of concern, most of them are not regulated at all.
Okay, yeah, as we mentioned, you have also touched this. What do you think governments and policymakers should require from companies involved in the plastic industry? Yeah, in terms of transparency, yeah, and also to make them accountable. Yeah.
Yes, I think for one, we need to move back more towards polluter pays principle and precautionary principle. We also need to make sure that that it's possible to know what a plastic product contains, because at this point, researchers working in this field have a really hard time even finding that information, which means that for consumers, it is not possible. So there needs to be more transparency as to what chemicals are being used in plastics.
So this is an interesting one. Also, I think a lot of us would want to know, do we expect harm to be hastened or lessened if microplastics degrade to nanoplastics? Difficult?
Well, we don't know, right? And this is a cause for concern that we don't know and that it is happening. We've done I've been part of doing experiments on microplastics to see how they form nanoplastics, and they do. But whether this is a health concern, we don't know. But I think just the mounting evidence of different aspects of plastics that are affecting human and environmental health is enough to know that we need to change how we produce and consume materials.
Okay, thanks. So we have the last question, because this is also, there are a lot of false solutions being put up. One of it is like in terms of make from plastics to fuels or plastics used in roads. There is a question in terms of, is there any research on emissions from plastic used in roads?
In roads? Not that I'm aware of directly. I mean, there's been a lot of research on tires releasing plastics when they drive on the roads. I've seen some shorter surveys on things that could be released from the roads themselves, but I don't know of a lot of studies in that area. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, because this is such a big field and it's really advancing rapidly. So I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm so sorry, but that's all the time we have for the question and answer. We have still, I think, 16 more questions to be answered, yeah, but we don't have the time. So thank you for the insightful questions, everyone, and thank you to Therese and also Nina for responding to the questions. Okay, we would like to now invite Yuyun Ismawati, yeah, my friend from Indonesia. Yuyun is co-chair of IPAN's Toxic Plastics Working Group, and she'll give wrap up the session and also give the closing message. Welcome, Yuyun.
Thank you, my guest. And hello, Therese, Nina. So good to see you guys talking about a very important thing, but we can't see, but it's very important. In our working group, we call it the Toxic Plastics Working Group. We discuss and we talk about various things related to plastics, but the recent one, and that probably Therese also didn't mention at the discussions earlier, that this week there are discussions at the global level about the concept or the idea for plastic treaty, what we would like to see in the plastic treaty. So some questions from participants also asking about regulations in countries, but I think it's more importantly, globally has to be an agreement, what to be used, what not to be used. And as Therese already mentioned, that the precautionary principles and polluter pays. So Nina and her generations will not be impacted further because there are still lots of unknown informations and data, especially when you talk about microplastics to nanoplastics. Nanoparticle is also another game that still have big unknown and lack of information. But I hope that from this discussion today, I understand that everyone, the participants in this call, already done so much in their own respective countries. And generations like Nina also started to speak up. And I hope we can support you, Nina, to spread out more of your works because your future is very important. And this is our legacy. Scary. That will be our legacy. So if we do something today that will help Nina and her generations later, not immediately, but I think all of us have to work together and then keep pushing until better solutions implemented. And I think everyone understand, and I know that everyone has been working in their field for more than 10 years, more than 20 years, some of us. But that's what we need because the industry also will keep developing new strategies and they keep putting money. So we also have to keep strengthening ourselves and learn more and more every day. So I really thank the sessions for today. The discussion is very interesting and it was fun, Therese, the way that you use the Prezi. And Nina, good luck with the COP26. Yeah, I hope you can make it to Glasgow. This is your opportunity to speak up to the wider audience and stay healthy, everyone. Thank you, my guest.
Okay.
Thank
you, Yun, for your closing message and inspiration. Yeah. Okay, so before we end, another reminder to the attendees, please kindly fill the survey form after this session. It will also pop up on your screen after the session is over, or you will go to your email. It's very short. Your answers will provide important feedback to improve our future IPAN webinars. Thank you. So I would also like to thank our speaker, Therese, Nina, our reactor, Leah, and Yun, and also our interpreters and participants for attending our webinar today. Thank you for joining us, and please stay safe and see you again soon for the next webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you. Cool.